year. And so without further ado, I want to pass it over to Kathy to first introduce herself, and then we'll go to you, Rick, right after.
It's so great to be here to talk about this great topic. Hi, I'm Kathy Polinsky. I'm the new CTO here at DataGrail. And my experience, I've had over 20 years of working in the tech industry at amazing companies like Stitch Fix, Salesforce, Shopify, Amazon, all of which are building highly personalized experiences for consumers, yet really building privacy by design into a lot of what they do. And so I'm excited about talking about the recent trends that we're seeing and how it relates to tech teams.
Great.
Super. I'm Rick Arney. I co-authored the CCPA as well as CPRA, and I'm very excited today to discuss what's going on in the privacy world and implications for companies.
Awesome. Maybe Rick, would you mind just, we've talked about this at length, but I'm sure listeners would love to just hear a little bit of, about the story behind the story, if you will, right? The why of or the impetus behind the moves that you made in 2018.
Yeah, it all started, surprisingly enough, it literally was with my friend Alistair McTaggart. Our children go to school together, and we were having drinks one night, and I had been the victim of identity theft, and it got really ugly and bad and expensive to clean that up. And we started talking about it and how we felt things were somewhat, for lack of a better word, out of control. The amount of information that was being collected on people without their knowledge or without any type of involvement in the control and dissemination of that information. That was the initial impetus to get involved, and that is what led to the original passage of CCPA, and then furthermore onward to CPRA. And it was all based on the feeling that companies were not respecting the information that was being collected and how they were dealing with that information. And so we tried to strike a balance between, really giving consumers power, but also allowing companies to do their business.
Yeah, it was such an interesting story. I feel like maybe not what people would have expected, right? You're a citizen like we both are, and you're looking to uphold rights for consumers across the state. So thank you. Yeah, I think it's interesting as we talk about this today, just seeing the move by the Attorney General towards Sephora, and what this really means for companies and the broader ecosystem as well. If we sort of take a step back and look at what happened with Sephora, there really is a notion around opt-out that now extends beyond just monetary value. And I think that's probably the most important thing to take away today, that this really is a mind shift. And I think, Rick, you'll spend some time talking about what that means and what you saw in the community leading up to CCPA. But, many of us, myself included, might have just associated initially that, the sale of one's information was just translating to, perhaps my email or my phone number. And if that information was sold to a data broker, then I would understand the concept of that's monetary value. But I think it's much broader than that. And if we sort of look to the example of Sephora, we're really seeing the Attorney General take a stand on, individuals that are trying to opt out of the sale of their information and honoring that opt-out request. And so what we're really talking about, if we double click one more level, is information that perhaps has been shared with another provider, and that does deem, the sale that is defined by the CCPA. What's probably most interesting as we go into our conversation today, we've been tracking this type of data around, do not sell requests and right to know requests since the beginning of the CCPA, and actually even before that with the GDPR. And I'd share that about 63% of requests that we see are in fact for do not sell, and that number is actually increasing. And so if there's one other point that I would share with the group as we lead into our conversation today, don't expect this trend to slow down. In fact, if anything, it would accelerate. And so really excited to have, Rick and Kathy talk about, what this really means for our community that we're in California, but also businesses across the country and internationally that are looking to do business with consumers. in California. So maybe first question for you, Rick. This surprised some of us, right? Like in terms of this decision. Do you think this was? Did you expect this? Like on sort of your order of things, would you say this was in the list, or why not?
It's a great question because I'll admit I was wrong. I forecasted that the Attorney General would probably out of the gate focus on children. We found that to be the most sensitive area politically is if you find out a company is misusing the collected information of a child, that just doesn't rank very high among anybody, right? People don't like that. However, what happened here is kind of interesting, and it's a good lesson for the industry is that what we think is sensitive today could be different tomorrow. And right now, I would say if I had to make an assessment of what's most sensitive, it's really geolocation of women. And that has become a very hot topic for a variety of reasons, Roe v. Wade being one of them. And unfortunately, Sephora was collecting that information and selling it or sharing it. And to your point, Daniel, it's very important that the definition of sale, and this is becoming more real for more companies, includes that notion of sharing for anything of value. So no longer can a company look at this and say, well, we're not really selling that information. We're just sharing it for the purposes of advertising. Well, companies are getting something of value for sharing that information, whether it's sensitive or not. And therefore, it's roped into CCPA and CPRA. And so that's one of the messages that's pretty clear from this enforcement action is information that we think is sensitive or not sensitive, that can change. And so it does require a culture of just all the information you're collecting, make sure that you're being a proper steward of it and thinking in a pro-privacy way. And then B, it's now becoming more clear that yes, indeed, CPRA and CCPA both have definitions of sale that are quite expansive. And that's the real message I would say coming out of the Attorney General's action.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as a woman that they mentioned the geolocation of women and prenatal vitamins in the Attorney General press release. And so I think that really ties to your comment that things change and public opinion changes on these things.
Yeah. I mean, like we talked about earlier this week as we were kind of preparing for today, we've talked for a long time, Kathy, about the challenges around actually solving this problem. And I feel like, our shared mission trying to solve this problem, it's clear you've run into it before at some of the businesses you've worked in, and seen customers challenged with it too. Why is this so hard? Like maybe talk the audience through that. Like what should we think about as we go to solve this problem?
Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work at a lot of amazing tech companies who really care about security and data privacy and really think about building, privacy by design solutions. But this is really hard, especially because of the rise of SaaS and the number of data systems that people have. So my experience working at tech companies that are really built on top of SaaS is that there are oftentimes over 100 different SaaS products that companies work with that store different personal data. It could be a marketing system, an email system, a sales automation system, and with shadow IT, which is a real thing, oftentimes there's not a consolidated view of all of those systems and where the data is moving back and forth, which I think is, some of the impetus for these laws is really to really raise awareness of the data proliferation that companies have. And so first off, it's really making sure that you as a company understand where all of the data sits, and then having an easy way to extract it and to analyze it and delete it if a customer asks for that request. So I love SaaS. I love personalized experiences. I love building them. And I think that they're the right thing for consumers, but you have to also build a system that consumers trust, where they want to share information. And part of that trust is being able to share out what you have collected, be very explicit about how you're using it, and enable consumers to delete that data if they require it or request it. And I do feel like, I think about these like data flywheels, where the more trust that you give to a customer, that you're listening to them, that you're respecting their wishes, the more they'll want to share with you. And so
Right.
I don't think that there's a conflict between, personalized experiences and data privacy. But if you break that trust, you will never gain it back from your consumers. And so it's very important to think about these things from the get-go, to build them into your workflows, and to be responsive to consumers' requests.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I feel like your Stitch Fix example, I remember when we first spoke there, it's just so interesting, because I think about Stitch Fix as really the steward of, collecting relevant information about me to tailor that experience. And to your point, I want that as a consumer. Yeah. Please keep doing that, because that's actually what I want. I just want also control of that information when you've collected it. That's the expectation that I think everyone has, and that's what we're seeing.
The relationship between a stylist and a client was really precious. Oftentimes, a client would tell their stylist before anybody else that they were pregnant or losing weight, or a lot of personal details that they oftentimes wouldn't even tell their spouse.
Right.
And so when we were building applications, we were really thinking about that trust of how we could listen to customers, how we could be responsive to them, and honor the trust that they were giving us. But when we were going public and doing our first launch in the UK and thinking about GDPR and CCPA, I would say it was really challenging. Just thinking it was really easy for us to map the data within our own walls, within our own systems, but then thinking out of all of the different third parties, which had popped up when the company was an early startup and didn't have
moving fast
structure, is moving fast. It took a little bit of time and a lot of focus for the teams to get a handle of it. And I'd say that the company now has done an amazing job of really respecting all of those needs, but it wasn't easy.
Yeah. It's also interesting, Rick, like just transitioning, and I feel like Stitch Fix is such a good example there, considering we're talking about Sephora today, right? I think it surprised me, and it sounds like both of you too, that we saw the AG actually look at a retailer, right? I feel like there are many other businesses that perhaps, it would have been the path forward for the AG to look at first. But, you mentioned when we spoke earlier this week, you've spoken with a bunch of different retailers as you were, leading up to the CCPA. And how do you think about that in terms of like practices that you'd recommend for retailers and consumer brands alike to think about doing this the right way?
Yeah, it's a great question, because retailers, of course, want to be as close as possible to their clients. And, one of the most amazing things we all know about it in technology is that it allows you to tailor the retail experience of an individual to whatever product you're selling, which is terrific. And consumers like that. But there's now this new quirk to it that in doing that, you got to be careful that you're going to potentially collect information. The examples given by Kathy are great ones. Other retailers are collecting information that people don't even know, like geolocation of women is the great example with Sephora. I bet if you interviewed, 100 customers of Sephora, very few would actually believe that information was being collected. Now, they might have when explained why that was collected, they might say, okay, that makes sense. I'm cool with that. However, now, when a retail company is confronted with really designing its services or goods towards the end user or the end consumer, the previous calculus was, okay, how do we get to them? How do we figure out how we can serve them as best as possible? All the apps we need to do that. What are the profitability metrics of doing that? What's deployment? Now, the new thing is, does the culture of privacy enter that decision? And what I mean by that is, if you look at all the apps and everything that's being done technologically in a retail organization, look at it through the lens of what information is being collected and where that information is going. One of the most interesting things I do these days, which I think is the most fascinating thing, is I having authored both CCPA and CPRA, is now I get to see the information flows in companies, and everybody, when they map that out, is shocked. There's not a single company I've dealt with that has done that exercise and seen where all the information goes and just information flows they didn't even know they had. Then they get their arms around it, and it becomes a very powerful moment, because A, they can see they can maybe even tailor things better with clients, and B, they can embrace the culture of privacy and even get closer to clients by respecting that information. So it's actually a good thing to do, and it's actually very valuable. And also, guess what? It keeps you out of trouble at this point.
Right.
And so the message I'd give to everyone here is be as comprehensive as possible, because in the situations I've been involved with, lots of companies, everybody is surprised at what they find. Or there hasn't been a single company I dealt with that hasn't found an information flow they didn't know they had. And that's a vulnerability that I think people need to engage upon and make sure that it doesn't impair their relationship with their client in the future from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. I mean, I feel like that's the consistent theme we've seen as we deploy DataGrail to our customers, right? One of the areas of functionality that DataGrail provides that Kathy described is you're really trying to understand the shadow IT and the associated personal information in that shadow IT. And if I were to reinforce what you just said, I would say we haven't seen a single customer either that said, oh, yes, this is exactly how the data flows work within our organization. It's pretty consistent that we do find shadow IT, and specifically shadow IT that, contains personal information on us. And I think that's really where it begins, right? You need to understand your associated privacy risk. That sounds like that's consistent with what you've seen, and specifically in retailers and consumer brands alike. Anything you want to add there, Kathy?
Yeah, I would say I'm not too surprised it's retail, just given the fact that retailers really want to focus on their specific products and their specific business, and therefore they end up leaning on SaaS more than other industries to take care of all the other things to help them get audiences, to help them manage fraud. And there's been so many different amazing technology solutions out there, third-party SaaS products that e-commerce companies can really leverage to allow them to focus on what's really unique to their business and not the things that are generic for everybody else, which means that they're often leveraging a lot of things for advertising and audiences and email marketing and the like to really make sure that they can get their voice out and their products out. It's also been so hard to do online advertising. It's just it feels like the game is changing every month, and things that were working before aren't working anymore. And so companies are leaning more towards collecting more information and doing lookalike audiences and trying to target more and more. But it means that there's more data that's flowing outside of their walls that they really have to have a really good view on to manage risk.
Something you touched on there, Kathy, is interesting, and it actually is related to what we talked about earlier in the week, Rick, of like the data going outside the walls, right? I feel like there were a bunch of companies I'm sure you engaged with, and we have too, frankly, that looked at do not sell and said, well, we're not selling information. There's no monetary exchange, right? You mentioned the do not, like, outside of the walls comment earlier in the week. Do you want to expand a little bit on that? Because I think that it's still not clear to folks that this is actually a really big deal. And your analogy was really, really simple, and I kind of loved it. I don't know if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, so the idea here is that because the definition of sale for CCPA and CPRA, most people think when you think of sale that you bought or sold something for exchanging money. I mean, that's probably 99% of what goes on in commerce. However, because of the way that companies are set up technologically and the relationship between those that use data for companies, that being advertisers or otherwise, is such that it's not always a payment for a service. People need to remember that with CPRA and CCPA, it's an exchange for anything of value for that information. Right. So let's be clear, if you collect information and it leaves the walls of your building, most likely, and it's very hard to make this argument otherwise, most likely you got something in exchange for that information leaving the walls. And if so, it's subject to CCPA and CPRA. And that's what Sephora found out here, because Sephora was not paying, they were not cutting a check to somebody to use that data. They weren't. Everybody should be aware of that, and everybody knew that data was being used for a purpose, and they were getting value in exchange for that, the advertising. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the information left the walls, and maybe I don't know what specifically happened with CPRA, but if any company looks at this, you have to realize if you have any consumer information leaving the walls, most likely it was for some type of consideration, and if so, it should be subject to CPRA as well as CCPA. Now, one other thing, let's be clear, we've talked a lot in this call, rightfully, about consumer information because that's what happened with Sephora. One thing we will touch upon in this session we have today is there's internal information that also I think people are unaware of that is sensitive, and that is employee information.
Right.
One of the things that when we passed CCPA and CPRA is we exempted the employee-employer relationship. We left that up to the legislature to decide. Now, the legislature has decided that, guess what? We're going to allow employees to make CCPA and CPRA requests. So an employee come January 1 will be able to ask for the information that a company has on them. Now that's disturbing to a lot of people, I'm sure, but again, this is about information. It's about all the information of the company, not just what you collected from the consumer, but now it's information you may have collected on an employee. Now, this is going to be worked out. There's a lot of things to think about. There's IP, there's a lot of laws already in place on what you can and cannot provide an employer or an employee that asks for information on them. But this is a whole new branch that people should be aware of that's beyond just thinking about external information, to your point, Daniel, which is correct. Think about what leaves the building, but there's actually information that hasn't left the building.
In the building too.
So you got, when you look one direction, you got to look the other too, because it's all about information and the stewardship of that information. So that's the message I'd send everybody here. It's certainly stuff that leaves the building, but you're subject to things that stay in the building too.
Well, I would say even employee information is leaving the building. If you think about interview systems and payroll systems and all the third parties that manage HR, there is a lot of SaaS out there, and I think many people have, because of the exemption, have not been focusing on SaaS for HR and internal systems because they've been exempt. But I do think that this is a wake-up call to really make sure that we're being inclusive of that as well. Before we talk more, I just am really happy to hear this is called CPRA instead of CPRA, which has been a mouthful to say, and I always have a tongue twist of it. So
I'll tell you a funny story. We had a raging debate on the team what to name Prop 24, and the final two candidates were CPRA and CPRA. CPRA was California Privacy Rights Enforcement Act. And
that's too long, Rick. I can't do that.
It was too long and it felt too harsh politically. Yeah. So we kept it at CPRA. So that's just so you know, that was the internal debate. And that
will make my day easier to say CPRA. So thank
you. Maybe we've obviously got the bullets on the screen here, but like, are there any areas that, we talked about employee rights, any areas that you think during your conversations with companies and lobbyists and different parties, Rick, that you'd call out for the CPRA? There we go.
Easier.
There we go. It is easier. That folks should consider.
Yeah, so we're in early days, and the Sephora things action is the first one. I still maintain that there are hot pieces of data, right? And clearly geolocation of women is hot right now, super hot. Yeah. Children has always been hot. And I've run across companies that have sort of inadvertently collected information about children, whether it be, you have an employee and that they have children, and somehow that because you held an event and invited the children. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that this information can get, and I'm not talking about companies that are focused simply on children. That's pretty clear, right? That's obvious.
Right.
But what I would say is, so think comprehensively, begin creating a culture of privacy around this. So, and then lastly is this new employer thing. I mean, I can share with you that, those that are in unions, the labor movement, this is kind of a hot and interesting topic for them, because from a lot of their perspective, and this is for the benefit of our viewers today, there's games that can be played with employee and employer relationship, particularly around unions. And I think one idea that I would share with people that they should think about is, if you are running a company right now that is potentially having some employees that are thinking of unionizing, which, by the way, is more popular now. We're having that's become way more popular. One of the things that CPRA may be used for, I'll throw this out to everyone, which I've heard of, is that companies that want to fend off a union organization, oftentimes they will try to profile their employees and think about, okay, who's actually doing this? Well, guess what? Now that information might be subject to a CPRA request, whereas before it was not. So these are just to give you a little vignette of some things I've heard about potential things that could come out of this. It's something to be aware of. And there's yet again another example of employee data that maybe we thought wasn't super sensitive that now is quite sensitive. And so it's, again, you got to capture all of it. And the way to do it is have a sort of culture of privacy that's positive. I mean, consumers want privacy.
Yeah.
It's clear. Polls extremely high. People want it. And Daniel, as you mentioned, probably the number one thing people ask for is just don't sell it. That's really what they're most concerned about. That was true when we were running polls too. It's just like, that's an area that cuts across all types of people. It doesn't matter. People just like, look, I'm happy to give you my information. Do with it what you need to do with it in order to accomplish what I've asked you to accomplish. But anything beyond that, please don't do. That's sort of the guidance I'd give everybody. The problem is that everything beyond that started happening a lot. People were like, hey, we'll serve you in this one way, but by the way, we got this side business we're making all this money on you don't need to know about, where we collected, geolocation of women and we're selling it. Like no client of Sephora knew that. I guarantee it. And so that's the kind of stuff that if you start thinking of when you buy a new app, when you implement new software, oftentimes people think, okay, what's the profitability of this? How much does it cost? What's deployment going to be like? Now it's all about what information is that collecting? Where's that information going? Is it staying in the building? Is it going outside the building? Is it subject to CPRA? Is it sensitive? Is it something someone might ask for? What are we doing with it all? And once you have your arms around that, I assure you it's going to be powerful for the company because you actually will get some very positive feelings about, okay, what can we do with this information to benefit the consumer and benefit the business? It's not a negative exercise by any stretch. Most of the times I've done this with people, A, they found ways to plug holes, and B, they found ways to actually serve clients more in a more tailored way. So it's not as negative people might think. It's actually a good exercise to do for a company strategically.
Yeah. And to be clear, I don't think Sephora was maliciously selling geolocation data. I'm sure that they were collecting this because they were trying to do lookalike audiences for people who lived in similar geographies as someone else. But
good intent.
But even with good intent, this is really hard and it really requires a lot
really
of
hard. Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to where they are because you're right. I don't think there's any deviant player there per se at all. Yeah. I'm very sympathetic where they are because they were just trying to serve their customers better. I mean, that's really very clear from the filings.
Yeah, but if you don't really look at this, that data could be used in, malicious ways that was not the intent of Sephora.
Yep.
Yeah. So you touched on it earlier a little bit, Kathy, but just like given where our conversation has landed, about the information that would perhaps be collected at Stitch Fix to create that great experience. How do you see brands or technology, companies sort of tying together, a great experience, but also being mindful of, the privacy concerns that are related to that?
I do think it really is first starting at your data map and really having an understanding of where the data is flowing. Understanding the technologies that you're selecting. There are some solutions that use the data that you share for what you thought was a perfectly reasonable thing for your customers to help train other use cases. And so I think, not just looking at your own privacy standards, but when you're selecting any third-party vendor, looking at their security and their privacy rules and making sure that they are compliant and prioritizing privacy. And, I think that is really important. I mean, I'd say when I was at Salesforce never used one customer data to train models for another customer. Like it was just the sense of like, we don't even look at your data, it's your own data. They were really trying to create the industry for SaaS, and the bar was pretty high for making sure that that it was going to be the same as on-prem. So I think that is really important of mapping. And then I'd say really thinking about customer choice and enabling customers to opt in or out of certain features. I know people who really like personalized ads. They discover new brands. They don't want generic things that are meaningless that they're going to ignore. I hate personalized ad. I don't want my information shared between companies, and like I don't want ads at all. But if I do, I don't want information from one company to be shared with someone else. And that's just consumer choice. And so we should enable customers to engage and share their information in the ways that they want to have personalized experience. I opt into things like Stitch Fix because that's a high that
I do the same.
Yeah. To be able to have someone know me enough to discover clothes that I wouldn't find for myself. But I want to make a day-by-day choice on how my information is used for the personalized experiences that I care about, and I want to opt out of the ones that are not the things that I want to engage with. And so we as technology companies need to think about that, to be asking not just a cookie banner that everybody has to click and it's as a barrier for them to engage at all with your site. I think that there has to be more consent focus and more choice in the matter.
Yeah. Well, look, I've loved the conversation today. I think, obviously we're excited just about how we can help brands with this problem. I think the underlying theme of trust, and I think you kind of touched on that, Kathy, around how Salesforce approaches this problem with just this mantra around trust. Similarly at DataGrail, like that is our sort of core belief that it starts with a trusted relationship between, business and a consumer, and Sephora is looking to do obviously just that. We work with a large number of brands like Sephora. About 40% of our customers are publicly traded. So we've definitely developed technology to support businesses through these types of challenges and have solutions that really are pretty easy to deploy without, significant engineering lift. But at this point, I'd love to open it up for a few questions for folks. We're happy to answer anything today, and look forward to putting out more content on this as well. But wanted to open it up for questions for folks in the audience. So I think we have. Yep. Okay. So we've got a question about related to questions about sharing and selling in a B2B setting. So if I understand that question, we're talking about, there's probably a couple scenarios there. One being in a data broker scenario. So someone is a business that actually is selling phone numbers or emails or contact information to another business. And then perhaps, a business like we've talked about that might be using targeting technology, ad tech, to, provide perhaps a personalized experience for their audience. Maybe Rick, do you want to start with that example? So we're talking about a B2B example where someone, might be sharing or selling information. Probably the first scenario being a data broker, second one being, ad tech. They're using ad tech like many businesses are to run their business.
Yeah, so this is a really key point right now where we are in the sort of life cycle of legislation and enforcement. Much of this call correctly has been placed on the notion of you have consumers that you face off to, and you think about your relationship with them, collect information from them, and steward that information. And then we've also touched upon the internal collection of information of employees. Now, the final frontier is this idea of, okay, you have a relationship between your company and another company, whether that be a data broker or a service provider. So what I like about this call is now we've kind of covered the waterfront of all that you should think about. The
Right.
B2B relationship's an interesting one because I think it's often thought of as, well, we have this business relationship. We're cool. We kind of know how you're dealing. We trust you as a company. It's not a 1 to 1 million relationship. It's a 1-to-1 relationship, right?
Right.
So on the positive side, that allows you to think about the notion of compliance with the law a little closer because you only have 1 or 2 of these relationships, or maybe 10 of them or what have you, but it's not 1 to 1 million. And the key notion there is one of contracting. You have to make sure that whoever you're doing business with, you have to notify them. If you yourself are the size and stature of a company that is subject to CCPA or CPRA, and you contract with these external companies, you kind of need to make sure you do need to notify them of that and ensure that they also are subject to the downstream implications of CCPA and CPRA of this
Right.
information. So there's a whole aspect of these laws, these two laws, that's all about the ecosystem of the information and who and how you contract with. So again, if you have the privacy culture down, then you know that if there's someone in your company that's contracting with an external party, a B2B relationship, the information flows and the contracting has to be taken care of appropriately. And that's what CPRA and CCPA demands. So, the comprehensiveness, that's what I like about this call, is we've covered across all this. The good news is we're not talking 1 to 1 million, we're talking 1 to X amount of providers, but you do have to make sure that they're honoring what CPRA and CCPA is asked of you as well. So monitoring your suppliers, monitoring your B2B relationships is going to be really key. And what I would say from an enforcement standpoint, just to leave it at that, I do think the relationship between companies and data brokers, particularly, there's going to be something in there, because just the huge amount of information it's going to be more about the numbers there than the individual piece of information.
Right.
So that's what I'd say about those.
So just on the ad tech scenario, so if I'm a B2B company and I'm using ad tech, how should I think about that? Because I feel like that's every business that would be targeting other businesses, right?
Yeah, so that's similar to what happened to Sephora. You have a situation where you may be contracting with an ad tech, and it may, again, most importantly, not be for monetary consideration. It's more for advertisements in exchange for the information. Well, again, most importantly, most likely, 99% of the time, that relationship previously was looked upon as, well, it's not really a monetary exchange, therefore it's not a sale. It counts under the definition of sale in CCPA and CPRA. That's the number one thing to think about here. That number two is making sure you contract with them and notify them about their obligations under CPRA and CCPA. And number three, something we haven't spoken about on this call, which is very important, which is a component of CPRA, is enhanced fines and penalties for hacking. So data security is something that people have to really be aware of too. That's a notion that it's not just about stewarding the data well, it's protecting it also.
Securing it.
Yeah, so those three things come into play when you're talking about a B2B relationship, less so with a consumer. The security issue is not as much because you're talking about that one relationship with them. But if you're providing ad tech with a lot of information, you got to contract with them under CPRA appropriately. You got to make sure they're stewarding that data, the downstream implications of them not selling it, and then you got to make sure they're securing it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So another one for you, Rick. Sorry to keep putting you on the spot here, but in terms of legislative changes that you see, right? So I think we'd all agree, right? We will expect more of these, not just even at the US level, likely at the global level as well. Where do you think this goes, and how should a business think about perhaps trying to future-proof? And I'm sure you have a perspective on this too, Kathy, from a technology standpoint. Future-proof their organization. Like, what steps would you say folks should consider?
Yeah, it's a great question. Like, so what should we anticipate on legislative changes, and how do we future-proof it? Legislative changes right now, the big push is children. In fact, there was a bill passed a few days ago that was going to really enhance the control of information around children, raise the age up to 18 of definition of child. Governor hasn't decided whether to sign that yet or not. But even if he doesn't sign it, that'll come back. That's a hot issue. So again, collective stewardship of children's information, but more broadly, how do you future-proof this? And Kathy, I'm sure you'll have some good thoughts on this, but again, it's all about when you're doing a business relationship, whether it be with a customer or B2B, it's less about, well, not less, it's always been about, okay, what does this relationship do for my organization? Now it's about the flows too. And the flows of information. Every time you do something from a business perspective, and I'm a business person, right? I was never a political activist. I've done business. I was mostly in finance. Usually when you think about a transaction or doing something, it's all about the economics of the transaction. Now it's about the flow of information, whether it's staying in the company or leaving the company, and what is this going to do for our privacy of culture, so that as part of our brand is built around privacy, we don't impair that going forward by violating it either in the eyes of the regulator or, more importantly, in the eyes of the consumer.
Oh, yeah, mute, Kathy. SaaS is not going away. I think it will continue to, we'll continue to see more complex data architectures and data flows. And so I think really getting your handle on this when you're small is important. But I also think data flows internally are getting more complex when you think about data pipelines and data lakes and data warehouses and your databases and your machine learning models. And so really thinking even internally for strong tech companies, how you're storing your data there. I expect to see more trends with data anonymization and really thinking about how do you segment out your data so that even when you have a lot of systems, you're not sharing everything. But I think I think the complexity is only going to get bigger.
That's a good plug, Kathy. We have our session with Salesforce next week at it's actually 10 days from now at Dreamforce. So if folks are going to Dreamforce, if they're in San Francisco, we have a session specifically on that and around anonymization and why folks are moving that direction. But Rick, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just add to what Kathy said. The question also was, what do we see in the future? Well, I think one area of CPRA that hasn't been used so much, which I think will grow, that'd be my forecast, is the notion of erasing data. So if someone says, hey, just, I don't want you to have this data anymore. That hasn't grown a lot yet, but it is there. It's in the law, and companies need to know how to do that. And it hasn't been market tested so much like that. I'm not sure the regulators are, is someone not getting all their information erased, but that's gonna go somewhere, I think, for not as popular as do not sell, but it ranks up there because some people are just like,
I do feel like that's the nuclear option when a consumer no longer trusts you.
That's right.
That's exactly right.
Have trust along the way, you're going to get fewer of those data deletion requests because you're keeping things protected within your walls, like your data flows, you're anonymizing, like whatever it is. But it is the sense of, if you're doing the right thing, I expect the companies that have the most trust with their customers will get fewer of those data deletion and erasure requests.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as a company, any company out there, if they see those requests go up, it's kind of a message a little bit about maybe there's a problem here. I mean, and you might want to interview some of those people and say, hey, why are you doing this? Because you're right. It could very well be that you've got some leakage you don't even know about, or you're not stewarding the information away. And people just say, I've had enough of this. I want out. Let me out.
Yeah.
We're giving.
Yeah. Well, look, I feel like the three of us could actually talk about this for another hour. I want to thank you, Rick, for joining us today and sharing your insights from pre-CCPA and now CPRA and where we're going from here. And Kathy, always a pleasure, obviously. And I feel like we want to thank you both for your time, and thank everyone that was able to join us today. And we will be doing more of these, and you might even see Rick again. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Talk soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.